Okay, I think we're ready to begin our Finance Committee meeting. Is there anybody virtual? Can you tell Vice Chair Mahaffey? I'm not good at doing both things, so I'm going to let, she's really good.
We have staff members, but
Okay.
no board members at this time that I am seeing. Maybe some will be joining us.
Okay, so we have Ms. Mahaffey, Dr. Martin, Ms. Scott, Ms. Kushner, and Ms. Carter here, along with me to start our finance meeting today with staff. And Jonathan Blueberg's here today. Welcome. And Superintendent Moore and other staff. So we can begin with that first. Do I have a motion for approval of the last minutes?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Opposed, say nay. Okay, motion carries. All right, I think we're ready to start, David, with our questions.
Okay, we'll try again. Good afternoon, Chair Cash, members of the board, and Superintendent Moore. At your April 6th board meeting, we presented the superintendent's proposed budget to you. Since then, board members have submitted questions about the proposed budget, and staff has developed answers to those questions. To begin your work session this afternoon, we'll provide a high-level overview of the questions and staff responses to those questions. After that, we will turn the meeting back to Ms. Cash and members of the board, and this will be an opportunity for the board to discuss the proposed budget and to direct the superintendent and staff to make any potential changes to the budget. To remind you of our timeline, our goal will be to have a final work session on May 4th, and assuming no changes take place at that May 4th work session, have the board approve their proposed budget at the May 4th board meeting. If necessary, there can be further discussion and changes, but a specially called board meeting would be required to approve the board's proposed budget because statutorily we are required, or the board is required, to submit a proposed budget to the county prior to May 15th. So with that being said, and without further ado, I will ask Ms. Terry Kimsey, our Senior Director of Budget, to review the questions and staff responses.
Good afternoon. We'll go through the questions and answers and see if you have any additional questions. They were arranged by category, kind of grouped them together, things that were similar. The first section is on federal funding, and there was a question about the COVID-19 related emergency funding the district has been receiving. And typically, our number of students is about 10 to 11% of the number of students in the state. Yet we've been receiving 6 to 7% of the COVID-related funding sources. So the question was, will that trend continue? And are there available updates on ESSER 3? So ESSER 1, 2, and 3 have been distributed to school districts based on the proportion of Title I. So that's why it's not representative of the total number of students in the state. We do have information from the state on ESSER 3, and we've provided those details in the response. And just to point out that when we receive the ESSER 3 funds, there is a requirement that at least 20% of the funds be used to address learning loss.
And it's proportion of Title I, not number of students who are
Yes.
eligible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
We do have an estimated allotment from the state for ESSER 3, and that's also shown in the response. That estimate is $214.8 million, with $42.9 million of that required to be used to address learning loss. The next question was on ESSER 2, and what is the dollar amount expected for 21-22 and the anticipated use of carryover? So built into the superintendent's proposed budget and provided in the response is that we are requesting and plan to use ESSER 2 funds to replenish base budget reductions that occurred in the fall of 2020. The reductions to custodial contract funds, transportation fuel, contract pupil transportation, academic advancement dollars, workshop expenses, and substitute pay for sick leave that were primarily due to delayed opening of on-site instruction. So if students will be on-site all of next year, we need to replenish those dollars that were reduced from the budget. We also would like to use the ESSER 2 funds for the maintenance and custodial costs for Willow Spring High and for the multi-year phase-in funding request for maintenance and operations, instructional support technicians, and social emotional learning. And as we mentioned when the budget was presented, even though we want to use the ESSER funds for those priorities, that does not mean that we want them to be one-time items. Our intent is at the end of the funding from the federal government, those would transition back and continue. So at the bottom, there's a chart showing the funding. Basically, for those items I just discussed, it would cost $33.8 million for 1 year. If we were to use the ESSER funds to pay for those for 2 years, because the time frame would allow for that, that would leave $28.4 million residual. The superintendent and her team are determining the use of those funds as they finalize plans for ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, and as we work through that process. The next question was about long-term expenditures in the budget that may need other funding a few years down the road. So we have used some one-time federal GEAR funding to support contracted and employees in the instructional support area. Right now, that's paying for about 310 months, or about 31 positions, at a cost of $2.3 million. In addition, the other items that I just described that we would like to pay from ESSER 2 would total over $32 million, and you see the breakdown listed in the response. So those are items we would anticipate on the other side that would need to continue from another funding source.
So just for clarification, the implication then is 2 years down the road, just to stay even, requires a $32 million to $34 million, depending on which numbers we use here, addition to the budget. Presumably, some of that would come from the state and some from local. Is that the thought?
Several thoughts. One is that we're trying in the interim to look where we do have some local savings that can occur and allow that savings to occur in the local budget so that we may have a increase in our unreserved fund balance in the short term, knowing that we would use those dollars to help us transition off these federal dollars. We would also look and see what's happening with the state budget during the time. Right now, we need to see what happens this cycle with the state budget to see if the legislature holds us harmless as they did last year. So we would, as usual with the budget, we look in totality. So we'll look at all of the funding sources, and all the things you mentioned are something that we're considering.
But in reality, the fund balance, the using savings would extend when we would need that, but it's still going to need to be there.
It will need to be there, yes.
So just for clear communication, we're really talking about another $32 million that needs to be in the budget, and this is where I think we have somewhat of a challenge in the way that we approach the budget, because we approach it as a local issue. But the budget is local, state, and federal. And we don't have a good way in the document to highlight that. And so I raised this like when we had the initial budget conversations. It feels to me like we need to have a tool where we can have some of that state and maybe more likely state than federal, but some of that conversation in the document so that it doesn't seem like all of our budget requests are just going local, if that makes sense. And I feel like this is one of those where it's going to have to be that balance between state and local, but it's going to look like a lot is the demand on local.
But how are we going to say that when we're getting so many federal dollars this year? I mean, I know we're going to use our fund balance to try to balance the budget, and that pushes that out like you were talking about. But it's going to be hard for me to say we're going to have to ask for that later, considering the CARES money this year
So
and next year.
the thing we need to say is that we need continuing dollars. These are not one-time dollars.
Yeah, I get
Right?
that.
That's the issue that I'm talking about.
Yeah,
Right?
I
It's
get-
sort of like, are we paying a bonus or are we giving a boost to a base salary? That we're talking about that same kind of thing. These federal dollars are great, but they're one-time or two-year dollars, and what we need for a school system, what we need for a business organization, is a long-term commitment.
Right, okay. Ms. Kushner?
Thank you, Ms. Cash. Just to add to that, but I think it's the difference of this budgeting. I mean, our budgeting is so complex, and we don't do it alone. But the only active part is the local in some ways, because we actively work with our commissioners, whereas the state and federal is more passive. Is that a fair way to put it, Ms. Kimsey? I mean, I understand what Dr. Martin's saying, and I think we should be advocating for greater state and federal monies, but there's not a easy way for us to actively do that unless we're missing it, and you can tell us how to do that.
As we're building the budget each year, we look at all of the priorities that are brought forward to meet the strategic plan of the school system. And then we look at those things that we know more than others. And we typically know somewhat what the state may do based on their formulas. We typically know federal, and granted, federal right now is much larger than typical. And then we look at what we can contribute from fund balance. And it does come back to that county number, because that's the only place that we get to request money to be considered at a certain dollar value. Everything else does come to us from other decisions made by other bodies. I mean, one thing to just point out is, in this budget, the superintendent would have to request a much larger dollar value for next year if we did not have these federal resources right now.
Right.
So this has been a modest amount to request for next year, because we do have these other resources available, and we'd like to lean on them during this time that they're available.
Yeah. And to your point, Ms. Kushner, I think what you stated is reasonable. And if one looks at the statute, it requires the board to submit a proposed budget to the county, to the local government, not to the state or the federal government, speaking to the more passive role. Now, all that said, a board member did submit a very good question directly related to this conversation about how the board might advocate more and better on behalf of the board to the state. And so I think that's the second to last question. Maybe we can flip it, and as you go through it, make that the very last question, because that would be a very good segue back to the board for their discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Katz.
The next question is, with the ESSER 1, 2, and 3 funds, if there's a question about the need to request funding from the county while we have these federal dollars, and what would happen if the proposed budget were to change if we were to ask for half the amount recommended from the county? So as I described, the superintendent and her team have a long-term plan balancing state, local, and federal resources. The request to the commissioners would be significantly higher if the one-time federal stimulus funds were not available for use next year. While there are additional federal dollars for use, the school system will save local dollars when possible, so there are recurring funds available as recurring commitments need to transition off federal funding. Part of the request for next year is to continue money we already have that the commissioners gave us this year as one-time funding. So a large part of the request for next year is to make that $11.9 million remain with us as recurring dollars and to increase it by $16.3 million recurring. We've shown you some history in the response. The request for 21-22 is less than prior year request. It's a much lower request if you look historically what has been requested and funded from the county. If the board decides to request less from the commissioners, there will need to be an offsetting adjustment. We would either need to reduce cost in the budget reductions. We would need to shift additional items to the federal funding, which then makes that situation years down the road more, or apply additional fund balance to the beginning budget, although the budget already recommends investing more than the board policy typically allows, so it would require us to waive board policy. Reducing the amount requested from the county appropriation at this time would lead to even higher future year requests of the county. The next question is about how many positions approximately are at risk.
Can I ask you a quick question? So that means the 27 million or so that we'll be requesting is going to be recurring, it'll be a request again next year?
It becomes part of our base budget. If the county does fund those dollars as recurring, that becomes the base county appropriation.
So it is still part of our local funding request?
We would want it to continue as part of our local. The next year, that becomes the base, and new dollars would be above that for the next
Right.
year's request.
Okay.
So for clarification on the table, in the 2021 school year, it notes that we received the 11.9. That was added to the base. And then in addition to that, there was the 1.9. So that would take that up to 23.8 if it were made recurring. Is that correct?
The 11.9 is what was one time this year, and that we want it to be recurring next year.
So does that mean that funded would have been zero if it wasn't for that one time? I'm looking at the table on page, which page is it? It's on page
If we did
4?
not receive the 11.9 as one time this year, we would have gotten a 0% change, a $0 change from the county. Is that what you're asking?
That's my question, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. All the addition they gave us this year was one time. None of it was recurring.
None of it was recurring.
And that
Okay.
was not typical. That was very unusual.
Okay.
And I think it was done because they didn't know what their revenues were going to look like. And I think the latest show that their revenues were $77 million more than they had estimated, so that the sales tax and some of the revenues to the county were $77 million greater. So hopefully that gives them enough of a cushion not to worry about our funds being built into our budget.
Yeah, I believe this current year, the 11.9 was actually a transfer from the capital side to the operating side on their books. So that's how they labeled it as one time. So we are assuming the state will hold us harmless again next year as the pandemic still impacts school systems. Don't know if they're going to do that or not. So we are listing it as a potential risk in the budget. So if they were not to hold us harmless, then there would be a need for an additional 508 positions that we would not receive from the state that we are expecting that we will. So we'll continue to monitor that as the legislature works on next year's budget to see what happens there. The next question is taking us into a different category. This is academic advancement funding. Does the special education student number of 18,463 students include students with 504 plans? What's the breakdown of that $18,463 number? What explains the decrease from 1920? And do we expect an increase in 21-22? So our special ed area has provided some details. The 18,463 students reflects the number of students with compliant IEPs at the time of December 1 child count. It does not include students with non-compliant IEPs or students with 504 plans. They have provided a breakdown of the numbers of students by disability type. It's difficult to determine factors that impact the reduction in numbers of students, not just with special education, but in general, just because of how the pandemic impacted student numbers statewide this past year. It was just a phenomenon we had not had. So based on the current trend and outstanding evaluations, we expect to grow by 600 students in July. And just like with all of our projections, we'll wait and see how those numbers come in. We have a multi-year plan for support to social emotional needs for our students. So there was a request to see what our ratio for those type positions, social workers, counselors, nurses, and psychologists, would be with the additional months added or requested to be added in the budget, and what that would look like for each of the next years of the phase-in of that request. So our staff have estimated that for you, and we are showing the ratios that we would expect to be at next year if those positions were funded, and for the subsequent years of the multi-year request.
Can you remind me what the target is, national target? I know it's, I think, 1 to 250 for counselors. I may be wrong on that now. But what are the target ratios? I should have asked this earlier.
I don't know that. But,
Oh, does anybody?
Edward, are you available to answer that question, or Paul Coe?
I see Mr. Coe ready to answer.
Yes, I'm here, and the ratios, Ms. Cash, was it for all the different position types or just counselors or social workers?
Each of them.
Yeah, so for counselors, the nationally recommended ratios are 1 counselor to 250 students. For school psychologists, it's one school psychologist to 500 to 700 students. For social workers, it's 1 social worker to 250 cases. And then school nurses is 1 to 750.
Just, oh wait, first, does any other board members have a question here? Can you repeat that? Ms. Kushner would like that, me too. We're all of the above.
Yeah, so again, counselors are 1 to 250. School psychologists are 1 to 500 to 700 students. School social workers are 1 to 250, and school nurses are 1 to 750.
And social workers are cases, not students, correct, Mr. Coe? You had
Yes, ma'am.
said that. Okay.
How does that correlate?
So I was just going to say, I think we need to change the way we answer that question for social workers, because I'm assuming what's in the chart that you've been provided is based on the total number of students versus the caseload. So we may want to just revise the answer to that question with the caseload.
And how does that look different, a student versus a case?
Yeah.
I think the way I might answer that is, one case may involve several students within a family who need supports versus, an individual student who's working with a counselor or school psychologist.
And some students may not be included because they aren't part of a case.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coe.
I do think that that's also a target that shifts and changes, so there needs to be some fluid sort of aspect to how those positions are allocated as well.
I would think at the beginning of a year, you may not have as many cases as you do at the end of the year or such. Thank you.
Can we get a little clarification on what a case means? Because it seems to me that 250 is a lot if you're talking about needing to make home visits. 250 is not as much if you're meeting with even groups of children at a school. So how do we define case? Because it wouldn't humanly be possible to do 250 cases that required significant home visits.
So Dr. Martin, thanks for that question. Before I speak too much on it, let me confirm with my team and get back to you all about how we're defining cases with our social worker team, and we'll respond to you in an email.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Scott?
And I appreciate seeking clarification and a better definition on that, because I'm sure that this is something where some schools may have a larger number of cases. than other schools. So if we're doing it just per pupil to aim for that at schools, that might not be giving an equitable response to that student population.
Well, and I just think that, this is helpful to know, because this is one of the board priorities, and to see where the funding is actually going to get us down the line. I think it's very helpful to see some areas are really impacted. Like the counselor, we're getting pretty close, but the other ones, I feel, really show how much work we have left to do.
Yeah, so the fact that post-pandemic and the goals, one of the goals, strong goals of the Board of Education 2 years ago was to focus on SEL. The rate we're going here is fairly slow to me. I mean, I know it takes a lot of dollars to get there, but it doesn't seem like we're focusing on that. So I'm disappointed in, especially a lot of this, especially post-pandemic, that we're not going to put. And I know actually it's going to be hard to probably hire a lot of these positions, but I'm also saying maybe one-time contracts to help us in a post-pandemic time when kids are going to come in with a lot of issues.
Ms. Cash, if I could respond to that. Yes, let me separate two things out. What you're looking at in the Q&A right now are the ratios that the business case, the multi-year business case for deferred operational needs would bring us to. That said, in addition, all the way through 2024, we've got significant federal dollars that we can invest, whether they be on a recurring basis with the need to replace them at the end of the fiscal cliff, or on a contractual one-time basis. So what you're seeing here in these ratios does not reflect what we decide to do with those federal dollars.
But we don't know what we've decided to do with those federal dollars, so it's hard to know what we're doing with our regular dollars. I mean,
those recommendations will be forthcoming independent of this proposed budget.
in this budget time? In this budget cycle, or we'll approve this budget before we know what we're going to do with our federal money?
I think they'll happen concurrently. But for purposes of now, we're not presenting to you a recommendation on ESSER 2 or ESSER 3. We're in the process of submitting or developing an application for ESSER 2 at this point. We're not even at the point of doing anything with ESSER 3 as far as the application yet.
So I believe, as an example, we have used CARES funds already this year on a contractual basis to increase support in SEL at our schools. And we have the funds to continue doing that. It's the availability of the people that is as much an issue, because just reaching this ratio will outpace the number of graduates that are coming through. So we've relied on contracts also, and we will do probably both moving forward.
Ms. Kosh, if I can point out, this is a great example of partly why I'm looking for a mechanism to include at least state along with the local in our discussion, because we can't depend on local to meet all of these needs. This is really a state obligation, much more so than it is a local obligation. We talk about it here, and we put local dollars toward it because the state is not paying for it. But this really should be a state obligation. We need a mechanism to be able to articulate this need, but we can't put it all in the local budget. So that's where I think we need to strategically try to figure out a place to have this kind of request, but we can't put it all on local, because local can't cover this cost.
I just think it's important to know as many pieces as we can, because how do we know what's appropriate to ask for local if we still have all of this other money that we haven't quite figured out how we're going to spend? And I understand, that's a work in process, but it's part of making sure we're trying to address as many needs and priorities as we can and get it covered as best we can, if that makes sense. So
The state does fund a formula for instructional support, and it's possible that they can make changes to that during their cycle. We just don't know that at this time. But I think that has also been a priority for the state as well. The next question is about the usage plan for our textbook funds. Textbook funding is one category from the state that we are allowed to carry forward balances at the end of a year, which is good because that lets us have a multi-year plan for how we use our textbook funds. We have a textbook plan in place, and it was developed pre-COVID for 5 years. Expenditures include allotments to schools, curriculum printing cost, curriculum supplies and materials, subscription licensing cost, and district text adoption. And we've listed for the 21-22 school year that we would expect to spend about $6.1 million, and we've listed what those things are. The spending plan for 21-22 will result in a carryover of $2.1 million for 22-23. The next question was just to ask us to provide a visual trend line of the increase in square footage over the past 5 to 10 years. So we've provided a graph there to show that. The next section of questions, well, actually, one question is in the area of technology, glad to see that there is a business case to increase the instructional support technicians. And while we're aspiring to the North Carolina school average of 1 technician per 1,956 devices from our current of 1 to 7,714, we'll need to know what that ratio is for Wake County government. So our technology staff were able to get that information. Wake County supports approximately 4,400 to 4,500 staff across Wake County government. They have 20 desktop support technicians that support approximately 6,100 devices. That makes the county ratio 1 to 305 technician to device. A question about child nutrition. Can you provide funding trends for child nutrition services over the past 5 to 10 years to show the instability in funding caused by the past year's disruptive COVID-19 pandemic? What's the best estimate of how those services revenues and enterprise funds will recover? Will it be over the next year, 2 to 3 years? Is there upcoming federal or state guidance or assistance available? And child nutrition has been impacted a great deal by the pandemic. And there also has been federal and state guidance and assistance that continues to change daily, it seems. Child nutrition, do you want to do this? Okay. Child nutrition services funding is contingent on participation. Federal regulatory agencies, changes to the school nutrition programs impacted child nutrition participation and funding pre-COVID. We mitigated the losses with minimal increases in meal price, which can also cause participation decline. Pre-COVID, CNS reserve funds were sufficient to cover the prior year losses, so they were okay pre-COVID. The CNS staff continues to evaluate the operating needs of the food service program in our schools. Factors impacting service levels include the students returning to in-person learning and parents' choice. We will continue to evaluate operations, funding, and cost and adjust service levels as needed. Full recovery is difficult to predict considering the number of variables that are impacting participation levels and therefore funding. At this time, we're waiting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to provide information on flexibilities that may be offered for the coming school year beginning October 1, as well as virtual academy enrollment, which are 2 key variables that will impact our funding for next year. The flexibilities that provide us with various ways to feed students at no cost are only authorized through September 30th. That could change. The federal funds do not provide revenues to cover all operating expenditures, and there are no state or other funds known to be available at this time to support child nutrition programs. Federal ESSER funds may assist with CNS program operations.
And let me just add one thing, and if Ms. DeLuca is online, I'll ask Paula, you to speak to this as well. And it's a great example of just how fluid a budget is. Since these questions and answers were finalized last night, we've learned some additional information about the federal reimbursement that is currently set to end September 30th of this year. Ms. DeLuca, if you're on, could you speak a little bit about what we know about that at this point, what we've learned just overnight?
Yes. So yesterday, the USDA issued a bevy of waivers that for the most part align with the waivers that we've been able to utilize this year, which has allowed us to serve all of our students at no cost and has allowed us to deliver meals in a non-congregate fashion out to neighborhoods via our buses as well as via curbside, and allow families to pick up their meals when their student is not present, say, in a vehicle. However, as I look through the waivers when I received them this morning, I've discovered that there is one critical waiver we're not really clear about because it's not actually ever present in the bevy of waivers we've received, and that has to do with an area eligibility requirement under this special summer food service program, which is a nutrition program under USDA. What makes that so very important is that is the particular waiver that allows us to serve the free meals at all of our schools. Typically, if an area eligibility requirement would be sustained in a normal year, that would mean that we would only be able to serve free meals to students at schools that had at least 50% of the children enrolled eligible for free or reduced price meals. And so I guess just to further illustrate the complexities regarding our program, we're really often in a wait and see environment because although USDA issued these waivers, they still have to be unraveled, and our North Carolina Department of Public Instruction then needs to determine how they will apply them in this state, what type of administration has to be considered for integrity on program operations. Are there any questions I can answer?
So those waivers were in place for this year, right? These are.
That is correct.
Okay. So we still had a shortfall for this year with the waivers, but we also are probably going to have more kids come back to school. But we know the virtual academy is going to impact us. So I'm trying to see what it is we're waiting for to develop a plan. I know there's something, I'm missing stuff. I know I don't know the complexity of this.
So the real critical piece here is additional knowledge around the type of waivers that we can use and execute for our meal operations. The reason why Virtual Academy is important is, of course, we will not necessarily have access to all of the students to feed at the rate that we normally would when all students are present in the school prior to COVID. In addition to meals, however, what's really important for everyone to understand is that CNS can't operate with just the service of meals. We have to sell items that are not part of our regular meal program to bring in revenues to offset our operating costs. And that is the one thing throughout this entire year that we've not been able to tap. And so it is with that, coupled with these waivers and the Virtual Academy, that we'll have to really form our program hopefully soon as more information becomes available.
Okay. The next question was about charter schools. We always have a lot of questions about this, so I want to try to clarify it. There is one pie chart at the beginning of the budget document just showing how our budget's broken down by area, and it shows that of our operating budget, there's a dollar value that's equal to 2% of our operating budget that's a pass-through to charter schools. That's the local amount that passes through to charter schools. So the thought is that could be a little misleading, and that amount of money is actually closer to like 8% of our local budget. So we will add a footnote on that pie chart to make that clear. We've shown in the response how we have calculated the $2 million. And I said this, the superintendent and the chiefs, when we were trying to balance the budget, I think we mentioned this in the presentation to you all. It is just an estimate. There's no way to know how much more we'll need to pay to charters until we get to next fall and know how our student numbers come in, how the number of Wake County students in charter schools comes in, what our county appropriation really becomes, and what those other local revenues become. I think $2 million is a good estimate, and I'll show you how we calculated. At the top, we're showing the projected number of students for Wake County, of Wake County students in charter schools, and the estimated county appropriation. The current expense portion is what is due to charters, fines and forfeitures, print shop revenues, red light camera fines. Using those numbers, the increase would be $1.4 million. Below that is another chart showing you the increases we've paid to charters for the last several years. If we look at the last 4 years and average those, it would be a higher figure, because as you can see, looking back in time, our increases each year to charters have been 5.6 million, 4 million, 6.3 million, 4 million, much higher numbers. So the $2 million is an estimate. It's between the lower actual calculation based on the numbers in the document at this time, which will end up being something different, and looking at our history and what we've been paying. If we end up owing more than we've estimated, that's something we'll have to add to the budget. We typically know that in the fall, about the time that we know if we have any additional fund balance available, and about the time that we're at the end of the first quarter and know if we have some over/under savings that have happened in the budget, which typically there is some there. If it comes in lower than that, then we would bring that forward at the first quarter, saying that the costs were less than anticipated, and that would go into the over/under savings. So that's how it's calculated, and an estimate. The next area is employee compensation and benefits. So we do have a multi-year plan to impact our non-certified pay scales, because we're having difficulty recruiting and retaining employees because we're not competitive with market. We know that last year we were able to get our bus drivers to a $15 minimum, and I think sometimes there's confusion on that conversation with the entire increase. Our multi-year plan is not sufficient to get all of our non-certified staff to a $15 minimum. So our budget does not currently include the goal of raising all classified employees to $15 per hour. We're proposing $6.4 million over the next 4 years for a total of $25.6 million to increase non-certified salaries. A recent projection of what it would take to increase all staff to a minimum of $15 per hour while addressing compression within each scale and among the scales would cost at least $55 million. We had planned a compensation study, which we put on hold due to the pandemic and uncertain economic forecast. So we do hope to continue improving our non-certified scales to be more competitive with market during this multi-year plan.
And I would just add to what Ms. Kimsey shared in the response, and I'm going to tie a couple parts of what's in the response together, and back to a point Dr. Martin and Ms. Kushner made when discussing relative responsibilities for funding of this Board of Education between the different legislative bodies, federal, state, local. I think this is a great example of that, in that this multi-year funding request of the local government to increase compensation is only a piece of the puzzle. And when one looks at the chart of what the state has or has not done as far as state legislated increases and providing the funding for those state-funded employees to back that up, and if you saw the chart that goes back to the Great Recession, it looks very similar. A lot of zeros interspersed with an occasional increase, one-time or non-recurring bonus. That really is a piece of that conversation. So I'll just point that out.
Okay, well, I guess I have several thoughts on that, and I'm looking at what's being allotted, and a good portion is going to be going just to cover the bus drivers, and what's in the proposed amounts, and I guess I'm trying to, and part of the question or the response was about a compensation study not being done. But this initiative to increase a salary phase-in has been in the budget since 2019-20 budget, I believe. I went back to that one, and it was in there. And so I'm guessing, I guess for me, what was the reasoning for not doing that initially, in the front end of it? Once it came, you see what I'm saying? Like, so you know where you're going, instead of, to me, I'm looking at this, and if I'm a non-certified or classified staff in one of the grades that are below $15 an hour, or whatever, since we're not doing $15 an hour, but the lower pay scales, I'm having a hard time understanding what it translates to. Does that make sense? We have money going towards it, but 1.5 million to just cover 6 months of bus driver cost. So if we look at a year of bus driver costs, that's, over $3 million. So I guess I have different questions, kind of like the front end. Was there a reasoning for not doing that plan so you would be able to say, we're starting here, this is our end goal? It was a 5-year initiative, now it's a 6-year initiative, so that our staff have an understanding of what that translates to them personally, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
Ms. Carter, let me try to tease out.
Yeah.
It's a multi-part or a multi-question set. So let me try to tease them out. Let me start with the bus drivers. And this speaks also to the complexity of our budgeting.
Right.
But the funding, the local funding that is required to pull the bus drivers all up to a minimum of $15, as well as address compression as you go through the bus driver's scale. That funding we already have in our current base budget.
Okay.
So none of this additional funding that is being requested, the 6 point,
Right.
will be necessary for that $15 minimum for the bus drivers. That's not a part of that request.
Okay.
Speaking perhaps to one of your next questions, as far as kind of the chronology, how did we come up with $35 million? Let me tease that into a couple parts too. First, it was never designed to be, as much as we desired it, would have desired it, was never designed to be a plan to get all of our staff to at least $15 an hour. While we would have liked to have done that, we were trying to work within what we felt was reasonable, could reasonably be asked of our county to shoulder, given that it is the state's responsibility ultimately to support our state-funded staff. The $35 million was based upon a market study that was done. I'll have to go back. It was done a couple years prior to our implementation of this multi-year plan. And that's what the conclusion was. It would take to become more competitive, not to bring people up to 15, but to be more competitive for non-certified staff. So that's where that number came from, or that was the genesis of it. As far as what have we done with it thus far, the first year, and you refer to that when you found it in the budget, because it had been so many years that our non-certified staff have gone without any legislative increase or minimal increases, we recommended to the board, and the board approved, and across the board, 3% increase for all non-certified staff. And we also recommended, and the board approved, targeting one group, and you refer to them, the bus driver group, to bring them to the $15 hour minimum. As far as what happens, as far as what recommendation we would bring back to the board, once we know what additional local funding is available to apply to the non-certified schedule, it may look similar to that, a recommendation, for the same reasons. Our non-certified staff for the past 2 years have received $0 increases, no step legislation, while the state for the last 2 years has provided all other state employees a 2.5% increase each of the last 2 years. So I'm doing some kind of clerical work, custodial work, maintenance and operations work, and I work for the state government. I got a 5% increase over the last 2 years. I'm doing the same work, and I'm a state-funded employee working for an LEA. I got a 0. In addition, the state legislated, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, bringing all of their employees up to that $15 an hour minimum. So those same staff doing similar work, state-funded, working for an LEA, making far under $15, doing the same or similar work, working for the state-funded, at or above 15. Did that help with your question?
Yes, and thanks for the clarification on the bus drivers, the way it was worded on the same page.
Yeah.
As that other information was a little confusing.
Understand.
And so, but yes, and I just, I still, have concern about where we're headed, because I just feel like we got the bus drivers were taken care of, and there's lots of other staff that are quite essential. And we are, have a lot of openings, 200-plus openings in some of these particular areas, so.
Understand. The last point I would make to that point, Ms. Carter, and to Dr. Martin and Ms. Kushner's point, is the state's responsibility.
And there are currently 2 bills out right now on that, so if anyone wants to follow up.
And just for reference, we are now competing with the state government because they pay more than we can.
Mr. Sutton.
So, Mr. Nader, before you leave, so given that is the, obviously we acknowledge that that's the state's responsibility, help me clarify a little bit and sort of in the first sentence, and I guess I'm looking at you and Superintendent Moore. What was our original goal? I think we all might have been under the impression that the goal was to get all of our employees to $15 an hour over this 5-year period.
Yeah.
And we were careful to not prioritize one group over the others, but we started with bus drivers and did all bus drivers because we were having some difficulty, recruiting in our transportation staff. So we've done bus drivers. So again, like I said, I know we were trying not to kind of prioritize one group over the other, but I think certainly the board, or maybe just me, that we were doing all employees. So now are we not? And I understand that changes with the state and that kind of thing. So provide a little clarity there.
Yeah, let me provide. I think we're talking about parallel paths. Okay. The language that I used in bringing the multi-year plan forward was that we wanted to address our lowest paid employees and hardest to fill positions. That might resonate with you that was language I used. Lowest paid employees and hardest to fill positions. And so that we would be using these local dollars to address those needs. And we started with bus drivers. The $15 an hour conversation has been present along beside that the entire time, but with an acknowledgement and a recognition that that is not a burden that should be borne on the local shoulder dollar alone, but that the state has some accountability and responsibility there as well. If we had the dollars and the plan to move to $15 an hour for everyone, it would be higher. And it would take what I consider to be some positive pressure that is needed off the state for them to continue to do work in that area as well. So we have never said that our multi-year plan would address $15 an hour for everyone. We said it would address our lowest paid employees and hardest to fill positions. But it is a parallel path with an expectation like we've had for social emotional learning with counselors and other areas where there is also a state obligation to go as well. And that's the part that we don't know where it's going to go. So we address what we can on our end with the support that we get from the commissioners for the local dollars that we have and that they provide us, at the same time that we are providing positive pressure and highlight and emphasis on the need for the state to move on those salaries as well.
So the $25.6 million is what it would take over the next $4 million to 4 years. Do you know at this point which groups that would then sort of cover at this point, or is that sort of difficult to say?
I would respond to that, that we will, each year that we do receive that additional funding, based upon current situational issues, and I'll use the bus driver issue, looking back in the rearview mirror, we're having a very difficult time recruiting and filling those positions. So again, similarly, assuming we get funding and we know it, as the superintendent and staff review how it would be applied, we will look at the current events, we will look at anticipated events, and come back with a recommendation for which groups that would be put forward.
So, I know we don't want to be pinned down on a specific group, but if I'm a custodian of 10 years, or if I'm a cafeteria worker of 20 years, and I'm listening to this meeting, how might I know or be able to project at one point within the next 4 or 5 years would I be at either 15 an hour, or if we're just addressing our lowest, that I would see some sort of increase, given the state hasn't done anything for me in, say, 2 years. Does that? And again, I know I'm pushing a little bit, but
Right.
I'm trying to get.
Right.
Mr. Sutton, I would respond a couple things, and it's been more than just the last 2 years, but it has been the last 2 years. That was that uncertainty, the very uncertainty that you're pointing out, that let's say a custodian, when am I going to get near there? When am I going to see anything significant? That was underlying our recommendation 2 years ago to use that first year of additional funding from this multi-year plan. And I do want to remind the board that for the second year, the current year, we did not request any local funding and therefore didn't receive any local funding for this initiative, given we were in the pandemic. But that uncertainty was a part of our rationale behind recommending an across-the-board increase 2 years ago, in addition to targeting a group, so that everybody in the non-certified ranks saw an increase. I know I'm not directly answering your question, but we do not know what the legislature will do. And it's obvious through this conversation that local funding alone is not going to solve this problem.
So my final, were you going to say something, Superintendent? My final question on this topic then, and obviously, given the questions of the board and different members have raised this, there is, I think, a strong desire by the board to see somewhat of an aggressive push and commitment on this. And I'm sort of reminded of the commitment that we made several years ago to our extra duty pay personnel. And there were years doing that where different things came up, and there was, we sort of backed off a little bit, and then we said, no, we're committed to this. We promised our extra duty staff that we're going to stay on the course, and we maintain our commitment.
Right.
So I guess I'm sort of looking at how might we sort of continue and sustain that same sort of push and commitment and aggressiveness towards that. And I guess where I'm at least coming from, not speaking for many others, but I'm not sure if the 6.4 a year over 1.9 billion budget exactly signifies the, I guess, aggressive piece that I think you're hearing the board say that we want to see in terms of a commitment to this. And again, I understand the pandemic and sort of where we are, but is there a way of how might we, I guess, up that a bit, or maybe send a little, particularly as this becomes the board's budget? So I hope that's a fair question.
Right. I mean, I will just say that I feel like, everything that you just said is part of a conversation that I had with somebody earlier today, even to the point of mentioning the commitment of the board around the extra duty pay over the last few years, as an example. So I think what would be helpful as we move forward would be to bring to the board, maybe by some chunks of categories, the amount of dollars that it would take to get to where we're trying to head, so that then we can have a discussion about how we want to stair-step that. And because part of what does hamper us a little bit is if the state moves on 2 or 3% for all employees, that reduces the amount we would need to be putting in towards that. Mm-hmm. But it's still going to take a while to get to it. So having an overall idea of what our goals are and what it takes to get to our goals, we then have a mechanism to say, okay, if the state does this year, that means we should do this in how we parse out our multi-year, which may impact our ask in our multi-year plan. So, but the multi-year plan will have to be a little bit more fluid than it is right now in terms of how we've set our targets. But I think the first piece would be to take the categories that we're talking about, review them with the board, show what the ask would be for each of those categories so that you have an understanding of the full picture and the individual dollar amounts. And then we determine, okay, if there's whether there's a priority order or an increase in the overall amount to move steadily in all of those areas.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, staff, for indulging me on that. I think the board would appreciate that.
Absolutely, and just to show it's not just our lowest paid staff, but those hard-filled positions like our HVAC technicians. And I think this year has showed us how important having good people in charge of our ventilation are. And so hoping that we can keep those filled as well.
Well, I'm sorry. So I guess when we did our $15 an hour for the bus drivers, it gave me a perception that was our goal for all of our non-certified. So I guess that's where I drew that. Even seemed like the right thing, I guess, at the time. But
Well, to that point, and I believe to Superintendent Moore's point, and correct me if I'm wrong, the $15 an hour for the bus drivers wasn't directly part of that year's portion of the lift. My recollection is when we had the acute need for bus drivers, you found some additional savings that helped at least do the $15 an hour that year. So we've got a couple of things going on. And to Ms. Moore's point, right, we have to have our commitment of what we're asking the county to do. The state needs to do something, but in that case, I'm 99% sure that we found some additional savings to address that acute need at that time.
Dr. Martin, I want to go back and research it to make sure, but my recollection is that it was this multi-year funding that was utilized. And again, in that year, all non-certified staff received a 3% across the board 3% increase that was retroactively made back to July 1 of the fiscal year. And then effective January of the following year, still the same fiscal year, we brought effective January 1 the bus drivers up to $15 an hour. We did not have enough funding to do that out of that money, the multi-year money, to do that on an annual basis. We only had enough to do it on a 6-month, but yet we had made the commitment. And then the amount to annualize it in the base budget, I think, is the footnote that Ms. Carter was referring to. And that we found savings to fund. That was the piece I think you're referring to.
Right, okay. So it was the particularly making it permanent because we got no additional lift which would have been required to carry that over. So we've got to sort of by hook or by crook figure out how to make this happen. But this gets back to that point where it is not just a local issue. It's got to be a state issue. So here's yet another point that we've got to find a mechanism in our budget document to really highlight the needs for the state.
The question 15 just shows you history of what has been adjusted in the conversations that we just had about salaries. There was a question about, given our shift for our local supplement for our certified staff, teachers and other positions that are instructional support, like counselors, social workers, et cetera, we moved our supplements from a % of their base salary to a flat dollar value. And the request was to look at what does that look like now if we look at those fixed dollar value supplements, calculate them as if they were a % of the total salary. This is different than we looked at in the before. So this chart does not show our % supplements. It doesn't show the dollar value supplement in terms of a %. This shows you our dollar value supplement divided by a person's total salary, base pay and supplement. So it shows our supplement as a % of total salary. And we show it the year before we moved to a flat dollar, we show it for current year, and we show it for 21-22. And we used one of our pay scales, the bachelor's A scale, just to show that visual.
Can I note this table is extremely helpful? Can I clarify that the irregularity in some of the steps, is that a reflection of our effort to use local dollars to smooth out some of the state's irregular step issues?
Yes.
Thank you.
And also, there are some steps on the state scales where there is no increase. It's
Right.
flat for a number of years, and we try to account for that and allow there to be some increase each year.
Right. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to clarify, because we used to have that the local was a percentage of the base. Not only do we need the local as a supplement to the base, but the state introduced this additional problem for HR that we had many years where people would get no raise, and so we're having to use the local dollars for that purpose as well. Again, using local dollars for what should be a state expense.
The next question was about our third-party organizations for managing employee benefits and making sure we stay competitive, too, on our benefit side, not just our pay side. So Wake County School System offers supplemental retirement plan opportunities for our employees in addition to the state retirement system. The school systems consolidated our providers of 403B and 457 plans over 10 years ago when federal regulations placed strict requirements on the operations of the plans. At that time, we bid the services and contracted with an independent agency to assist in the selection and management of 403B and 457. We bid these plans every 5 years to maintain competition and produce the best product options for our employees. Every quarter, our cafeteria plan provider provides feedback on the latest trends and benefits being offered across the state. In response to the trends, Wake County School System offered a new competitive plan or guarantee of participation in an existing plan. The school system has tested the market by sending a competing company the employee cost structure for each of our products. The company declined to compete due to the low employee costs coupled with the zero employee fees. These products are selected at the option of the employee and carry no cost to the system. We are self-insured on our dental plan, and that goes through an RFP process similar to the supplemental retirement plans. Other plans with annual reviews include the flexible spending accounts for medical independent savings, as well as our vision plan.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. If you don't mind me following up, I think we've just had a great conversation about illustrating how we can't control the salaries of a lot of our staff. But one thing we can control is the benefits package that we offer as a supplement. So I really wanted to underscore the need for us to be very proactive, make sure that our benefits are competitive. Maybe, I don't know if we've surveyed our staff recently or been at all, asking staff about, I said, 10 years ago there were major changes, but do we ask staff, are you happy with your benefits and what would you like to see more of? I mean, do we have the package that our staff thinks is competitive? I'd rather hear from them in some cases than the agency that we work with. So I just think it's really important, since we can control this, to make sure that we're doing the best we can by our employees.
And then we're down to the last few under miscellaneous. A question to ask about the per pupil expenditure for each school. The most recent data available is on DPI's website, and that's for 2018-19. There's not any more recent information available at this time.
Do you have any estimate on when it will be available, since we're over halfway through the school year? Because I had assets the previous year, but I think it's important for transparency to be able to see that, because there's a wide range based on school.
Yeah, I actually contacted Department of Public Instruction, and they were finalizing the report within the past month, and they hope to have it available for everyone in the report cards section loaded within the next month. So,
thank you.
There was an error on one of our cases, and we've corrected the name to say Research Triangle Park, and that was already corrected on the online version, so all the public budgets have that correction in it. The last question before the one for board conversation was a question that came in yesterday concerning athletic fields and facilities across the district. We didn't have time to get that response prepared for today, so we'll include it for your next work session. And then the final, I think more of a comment to prompt board discussion from a board member, was what can the board do to secure more stability of funding given the instability and uncertainty at the board level?
Does somebody have a solution to that one? Yeah, Dr. Martin, you might.
I wish I had a solution. I have a suggestion of a step in the direction. We did a lot of work back in either January or February on our legislative agenda. And in that legislative agenda, we had a number of fiscal-related items. I'm wondering about, right, because that's something we've already worked on, we've already developed language for. I wonder about incorporating that into the budget document simply as a public recognition that our budget, well, here we're asking the county, it is a bigger picture, and it just strikes me that there could be some utility in taking that document that we've already approved and having that, right, we get the superintendent's letter, we get the board chair's letter. It strikes me that potentially even maybe directly following that, we might incorporate our legislative agenda. So not a solution, but at least a potential mechanism to highlight some of the need.
Yeah, I think bringing it to the front for focus is the biggest thing we can do. No, not the biggest thing, but one of them.
You have to see a problem before you can solve it.
Yeah. Good point. Is that a possibility? So that, other questions, Ms. Mahaf?
Well, I know there's been a lot of work happening, with the General Assembly using the School Boards Association to talk about different bills. In the past, we've had a lobbying firm that we contracted out to, but, perhaps that's something that we need to discuss again about how we can have those conversations, short of one of us sitting on Jones Street and, sitting in that building all day.
And I would just chime in that I do agree. I've spoken with other board members about that in the last few days as well. We did reach out before the holiday break in December to 2 different individuals and did not pick up a lobbyist. And so we really need to think about, there's been discussion in the past about whether that should be a contract or an individual person and that sort of thing that's on staff. Just something I think that requires some board discussion and maybe get a alignment and a head start on that for next year.
Well, I think it's important because there are so many state issues that affect us and are leading to that instability. I mean, I think our discussion around the charter schools shows that we had so much pressure this year and there was so much demand for planning, and yet if it's dollars or enrollment or budgeting or staffing, the charter school funding is simply from the state level and the local level is simply creating less stability and less uncertainty that I think we need to underscore for taxpayers, that it is not in many ways an efficient use of taxpayer dollars when you're creating less stability for the majority of the children in our state and in our county. So I think, and given the great work that our teachers are doing, the innovative work our teachers are doing, I think the innovation in public education in Wake County, at least, is happening in the Wake County public school system. And the charters were supposed to be innovative. So I think we've cornered the market. I am biased, obviously, but I think we need to underscore that for taxpayers because it's public money.
Yeah, I certainly echo my colleagues, and I mean, I can sort of sit down there sometimes for us, but I do think it certainly is an impact because of the uniqueness of our county. But I also don't want us to get lost that there are also, in my opinion, a large number of partnerships that we can start leveraging. Specifically, our business partnerships. I mean, every one of them have a lobbyist, and it's not a partnership we really have pursued to say our district is an economic driver. Actually, almost all school systems are, even in our rural communities. And so putting some of the onus back onto our community, not just around partnerships in our buildings, but partnerships in advocating. What business people understand is our financial circumstances, and they also understand that the uncertainty and instability of finances impact our ability to continue to deliver. I really think that we should be doing a huge, large push on helping people and I said this to Ms. Cash, our narrative doesn't exist. Public school has always spoke for itself. You didn't need advertisement. We are beyond that. We are at a place as a public school system that it's a competitive market. This is what people wanted, some people, and here we are. And you can't compete by being silent. And You don't actually pass legislation on Jones Street. You pass legislation before you get to Jones Street. People decide how they're voting before they ever vote. So if we wait till we get to Jones Street, then guess what? We're still going to be sitting in this place. And so I think the conversation starts before Jones Street.
That was really well said. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. We all do. That's true. Partnerships, I've always felt, were the one thing we had to work really hard on.
And I like your language of that we are the driver of business in this community, and that's in the interest of the 70% of folks who do not have school-age children, that our schools be successful, that they are 70% of those who pay our local portion of our budget do not have school-age children, and they have a stake in our schools that we need to leverage, as Ms. Johnson-Hostler has illustrated.
And guess what county and state does when they're selling our community to business? They don't ask where your kid is going to school. The assumption in the narrative is it's public school. So that narrative piece is there, and it's up to us to kind of leverage and uplift that.
Do we have any other questions or comments about the budget so far? Kind of a segue into what you guys were talking about. This has nothing, it does have a little to do with the budget, but I do know, and I'll ask you, Superintendent Moore, our schools are all waiting to get permission to let all of our community partners, such as our churches, go back to their buildings. And because of the amount of commercial space that's available now, some of our pastors and other people are using our schools, are looking at other facilities because they haven't been given permission to use the schools again. When is that going to happen?
So that's a multiple-pronged question in terms of who may be wanting access right now, right? Because we've got the communities and schools, rentals, and those sorts of things, and we also have volunteers. There's I got an email this morning from an organization that wants to plan for next year to make sure that the program that they've had in the past, that it requires volunteers in buildings, will be okay for next year. So I don't know if, I know that AJ and HR has worked some on the aspect of volunteers, because the DHHS guidance still says to limit volunteers to only essential folks in the building. So we do need to see how that guidance evolves as well. And then also with, I don't know if Tim is on and can speak some to any of the community use requests. I think those have started coming through, but I don't know if you're talking more about volunteer organizations
well,
than
I'm
you
talking
are
about churches. They give a lot of money to a lot of our high schools and middle schools, and they can't wait, I don't think, any longer. I think they're going to have to decide this month whether they're going to go out and rent commercial property. Okay. That's what some of the principals have said.
Tim, are you on?
I am online. Yeah, I am online. I'd be happy to speak to that. It's also well-timed. Ms. Cash has spoke with Linda Wilcox and Jill Touchbury about this just a day or two ago. We have been.
Can you talk a little louder? They're not hearing it exactly. I'm sorry.
The air vents are very loud in here.
Yeah, we're in an airport out here.
Oh, okay. I have your question is well timed. I've been talking with Jill Touchbury and Linda Wilcox about this just a day or two ago. We've been in touch with all the churches. You are right. We absolutely do not want to lose them as customers. They're great customers, both just as customers, and also, of course, as you pointed out, it is very helpful to the schools to have the income that those churches bring in. Most of our churches have stuck with us, many of them in parking lot gatherings, and we are working with them now to get them indoors, looking very closely at Executive Order 204 and what can be allowed. For some of them, the 6 feet of social distancing is probably adequate in our cafeterias and in our auditoriums. And we may need to change a little bit the footprint that they use, but we do not want to lose them, bottom line, no pun intended. I would hope any week now, I mean, we're like that close, that we will begin to move, not just churches, but as many of our customers as we can back into the buildings where everybody obviously was pre-pandemic.
Yeah, Ms. Kushner?
Thank you, Ms. Cash. I wanted to also ask as Finance Chair if we can have at a future Finance meeting a review of those supplemental benefits that were highlighted. I know it's not quite part of the budget, but if Dr. Matillo doesn't mind following up just so we get more information on that. Thank you.
I think he's looking forward to that. Great.
Control your controllables.
I love it. Okay, yeah, control your controllables. We don't have any of those. That's good. I did want to say, and I still feel like our maintenance and operation, I would really like for us to use our one-time funding CARES money to take a bigger chunk out of it than what we're doing. I just don't feel like we're going to have another opportunity like we do right now to get to that. And I would, as one board member, and I hope that there's support that.
I sure do.
Okay.
Yes, I think
who supports
the
that?
districts that have older schools would be all for that.
No, I strongly support that, in part in that those, right, if we fix something, yeah, maintenance is ongoing, but if we fix something, it lasts for a longer time. So maintenance and operations is, particularly the maintenance side, is closer to a one-time expense than many of the things we'd use the federal dollars for.
That's what I thought, and good, because I really think this is our opportunity to try to catch our schools up on their maintenance and operations. So I'm not sure when we'll get a plan for that, but that, Superintendent Moore. Okay, you heard, yeah, okay. Okay, thanks.
Kind of a piggyback on that, I know it kind of came up when we were doing our small group facility breakouts last week about the HVAC, using some of that specifically for that too, if that, I don't know if others have interest in that or not, but seeing if that was a possibility.
I think that's a widespread conversation across the state and DPI and other folks around acceptable use of those dollars. And I think Mark Winters was just saying that it actually came up in a finance meeting at DPI today about that being an acceptable use of those dollars.
Really, any other comments? Okay, meeting adjourned.